a fabulous panel with a huge amount of knowledge between everybody. And we're also live streaming this session, so it's going out across the world, no pressure, so that if everybody in the panel can give their best answers, it's really important because we are going to change the world. So here we are, Indian Fibres. So what I'm going to do is to hand the mic to each panelist so that they can introduce themselves and give you a short synopsis of what they do.
Hello, I'm Phoebe from Pico. We produce organic cotton underwear in the south of India, and then we work with various organic farmers cooperatives, one which we produce hand-woven towels, which are from a rain-fed cotton native to Gujarat, and we've been working with lots of localized circular supply chains, trying to keep things as close to the community where they're produced. So we've then gone on to working in the UK as well on the Slipper project this year, working on fibres from the southwest of the UK, but predominantly the last 6 years we've been working with groups and with cotton, mainly cotton in India.
Hello everyone, welcome back today. I'm Jo Salter and I'm the founder of a business called Where Does It Come From, which is all about transparency and traceability. So we put a code on the label of all of our clothing that we make, and it enables a customer to scan that or type that in, find out the whole story behind everything that we create with them. We've been going since 2013, but we very much started as a retail brand, and we've now started shifting to be a more B2B brand, and that's primarily because I don't really want to be making things that the world doesn't need, and there's plenty of other much better fashion designers around than me. And also, I think a lot of businesses have big budgets and have to try and impress the world now that they're actually taking the environment seriously. So we really want them to be spending their budgets, or I want them to be spending their budgets in a much better way than they currently are. So we've been working with Khadi, Indian cotton, since 2013. And we have a small number of social enterprises in India that we work with, and we work with Khadi London. I'm also an exec director of Khadi London, and I love Khadi. I think it's an absolutely fantastic, versatile fabric. We primarily worked with cotton, actually. My expertise is really around cotton, so I'm hoping other people can answer the other fibres.
My name is Skelton. I'm a kind of artisanally led menswear clothes. We make 2 collections a year, and I predominantly use hand-woven cottons from India, a lot of wool from the UK, and linen from Ireland, and everything is made ethically within the UK.
So hi, I'm Rachel Sheehan. I'm founder of Circular Earth, which is a fashion consultancy helping small to medium-sized brands to either move from non-sustainable to sustainable futures, or start up strong. So I have courses that help people in different industries understand how to create a brand from nothing, essentially. Yeah, over my years, I've kind of done brands right from concept and trend all the way through to doing photo shoots and working with supply base and everything. So I'll keep it quite short, but I also have a thing called Ecosystem Incubator, which is about bringing people together and working in collaboration. So I'd like to speak to that a bit later. Thank you.
It's a little bit.
Hello, my name is Soma, and I come from a very different background, if you like me to. To everyone, my background is material science and engineering. And I came to the space from more like a technical background. I was really, I was working in India with the foundation that was actually focused on energy access, but through livelihood development. And one of the livelihoods that they were working on was handloom. And the project that got me very invested in this whole industry was how to lower drudgery through technology in these sectors. And so that led me to, I'm now finishing my master's in engineering for sustainable development, and it's focused on how these organizations actually address these gaps in sustainability that we see in all fashion and also development interventions. And it does look at some of the role of technology, but I think there's definitely, I think, like somewhat of sometimes a de-emphasis on technology because of how many negative associations there are, especially with factory production. But one of the things that came through definitely when I was in the research is that there are ways to do it correctly, and so I'm interested in exploring that space better.
I'm Paula, and I'm a textile designer by practice. Once I graduated, I went to intern with Hamid, which is a ground roots organization based in Dutch. They had a very interesting, successful revival model that they had done with Kala Cotton back in 2007, starting from then. So it was really interesting to learn a lot from there, and I was then got associated of looking at building the value chain of swag, so interacting and understanding the different sort of places that the different stakeholders came from, be it spinners, weavers, the herders. So that was quite interesting, and I worked there for 2 years, and then I have also been working with Fibres, which is a self-help group. If you see the pieces hanging that side, those are some of the groups that we recently developed. And yeah, there are about 9 women who work with local women and they've always known how to spin and weave and sort of, yeah, and I got involved with them to develop new products. I'm currently in London doing my master's in biodesign, which was sort of like when I make and create as a practitioner, I always wanted to look at how even natural fibers has been something that I've always worked with, and I would always love to keep working with it. But just making more consciously sort of led me to this direction, just looking at how biology can also help us create more lightly for the earth.
Different things. I think you'll all agree we've got a fabulous panel here, all with very different strengths, but also with a common knowledge of how they want things to work and how things are working at the moment. So one of the first questions I'd like to ask the panel, if I can get it working again, is, which is something you've all brought up in your introductions, is localized versus centralized. So looking at localized production, small amounts coming through, as opposed to those big multi-million factories that produce 20,000 shirts and then see who's going to buy them. So if I pass to Phoebe.
Yeah, I think well, localized production is, as we touched on, definitely something we've always wanted to work and focus on with Pico. We've been working with Khmer through Keyshore through the last couple of years as well with our towels, and that was a real showcase of having like the farmers nearby and the spinners and weavers and everyone interconnected through that organisation, and therefore you have that connection and accountability and shared responsibility. And I think we've really seen the flip side of that as well when working with Jersey, because that's what we did for our underwear. And as I touched on yesterday, we haven't quite gone down the cardi underwear yet, but maybe we will one day and have hand-spun knickers, but we're not quite there. And so we have been working with Jersey, and that was one thing that was quite difficult, was to find a Jersey fabric. And we haven't quite got there, but we have in terms of like everything else we're using in our production. Like the bags we use come from handspun cotton, which is from Tamil Nadu, which is where we produce the underwear, and trying to keep that as small and connected as possible. We're only working with 10 farmers for that, and it's this, like we were talking about a bit yesterday, is that scalability of, if you're only working with a very small cooperative and then you grow and you want your business to grow in order to support more artisans and more projects, but the only way I can see is that then you also work with multiple small localized cooperatives, and so that's kind of the direction we've gone in. One thing, we've just constantly been trying to achieve is, even with our jersey, is that everything is processed in that area. So the dyes are processed and then go back to 95% drinking water, and it's safe drinking water. And then there's just a bit of cement, basically building material, which is left over, and that's all local to the factory. So I think, again, it's like, when you can, like, keeping those things as near and circular as possible, and if possible, give it like that, also entering like, how do you put it, like actually being able to be sold locally as well, and that for people to be able to buy it and it not to feel something that's just exported. And I think that's a big thing with Cardi, and I know that Joe will know more about this at the talks last year in Jaipur, that they were talking, and we heard at the Indigenous Seed Conference 4 years ago, was this importance that those producing the cotton or any fibre also can then afford and feel would like to be wearing the cotton and proud of wearing the cotton, or whatever fibre it is as well, and that whole circular connection, and then it can biodegrade into the soil. Soil to soil economy, exactly.
Sorry.
No, you're adding.
You said that also well, I'm not sure what I could add. So where does it come from is about transparency, and that's where we started from. So finding out the stories behind them. And I think people connect with stories, they connect with knowing the people behind things, seeing the pictures and videos of people, because they can't always go there if it's in India, the other side of the world. So I think for me, doing a local production, a small productions, you do get to access those stories, and that means that people buying things are more fully connected to them. However, as soon as you start trying to grow or get that higher demand, it's much harder to keep that local connectivity. There's some amazing work going on though. We did a joint project with Cardi London last year for our face masks, because when we all realised what was going to happen in terms of face masks, there's lots of plastic, horrible ones being created, there's lots of ones with nasty chemicals in. So we worked with an organisation called Gram Seva Mandal in Maharashtra, and they have a wonderful local model where they grow the cotton. It's rain-fed organic cotton grown in the fields around the cooperative. Then that cotton is spun and woven in the cooperative and tailored in the cooperative. So everything all in one place. You can see them, there's some on the desk. But, so that kind of local impact, everybody in the community is involved in some way or supporting it in some way. And it's the complete antithesis of people having to leave their rural communities and go and work in the cities, and whole lifestyles change because of that. Families are split up, and it's just not what we really want. But the danger is, of course, when things start to grow, you move away from that, and not only do you lose the local community impacts, you also lose that transparency in those stories. So for me, that's what it's all about.
I guess from my perspective, something that I can add from actually like making clothing and how important it is to be local is like the impact you can have on the quality of the clothing when it is local. So when I kind of first started, I tried, like, in terms of like garment manufacturing, tried lots of different options like within the UK, and it always seemed like the best one was the one that was like closest to me. And now the people that make my clothes are like about half an hour cycle from my studio, and that has meant that I can kind of really kind of keep a handle on how the clothes are being produced, like who's making them, and I have like now a personal connection with all the people that are doing all the different processes, and I'm able to probably do things that I definitely wouldn't be able to do if that whole process wasn't localized. Like there's so many things that I wouldn't be able to do, which is why like much larger brands are not able to be as sustainable, because if they're like, for example, sending their clothes to Italy to be made and they're based in the UK, there's such a large kind of disconnect between those two things. So I guess that's, I don't know, my kind of my experience of why that part of working locally is much more beneficial than doing on a kind of a large scale.
So, as I've gone through a career sort of in sustainability and a big career in fashion in the original industry, I did notice a massive disconnect, and you were speaking to it as well, in terms of we'd moved away from where we were sourcing our things. We were disconnected from it, and what I'm hearing from everyone here is that you're reconnecting. And what I really want to speak to is that systemically, so that we can start to build within even bigger companies, so that we can also, as small to medium-sized businesses, start to come together to forward that change. Because we can do all of this in isolation, brilliant, but I think the bigger picture is how we bring that together on a new economic scale. So I've studied new economics for a couple of years in terms of how we start to move away from it being just about GDP growth and about recognising people and planet as the same values. And yeah, with the ecosystem incubator, we really started to bring people like Kishore and other people together to start to then work together to help other brands to join up on minimum order quantities, for instance, so that then, you know, everyone is nurtured in the system. So I think that's me for the moment.
Thank you for the responses. I think I don't have experience from the fashion business side, for sure. And I think when you ask a question like local versus centralized, there's like there's a lot of drivers in that system. And like I think the drive to centralization was, you know, this growth, like some people wanted so many things. And the best way and cheapest way, basically, to do it was to centralize these factories. And there's this question of like, as you guys were saying, that when you start reconnecting to these local organizations, there's this desire to bring that to more communities, to like empower more artisans. There's like, but there's also there's a balance. Like once it gets too big, you don't actually know what impacts you're having. It becomes too big to actually stay transparent. I think like from what I've talked to I've talked to Kamira. There's a few other organizations that I found were, I think, very inspiring to their models, like including Urmul and Rangasutra, where a deep part of their ethos was capacity building, which, you know, I think it's a huge buzzword, but ensuring that you're not just it's not just livelihood that you're giving these artisans, but for example, the reason why Rangasutra, I think, does such a good job of capacity building their communities is partially because their artisans co-own the company, and they are trained to be craft managers. What they enter this ecosystem with their skills, and then the ones who show some excitement, show some leadership, they organically become like craft leaders, and then they're able to manage larger organizations. And these are people who like have, you know, 4th or 5th grade educations, right? But through experience and through the opportunities they can find, they're able to expand that. And like and I would say like decentralization, I think, is still a huge theme, but the idea is you can stay decentralized if you equip more people who are aware of these contexts with the skills needed, rather than like just a income necessarily. So I think that maybe is like something in the model that has to exist, that it can't be just I'm sure it's not in most of, I mean, Khmer is also definitely not just a transactional model, but I think every local organization should pay a lot of attention to that specific relationship, because I think that has the power to propagate more. So that's like, maybe, I don't know.
Thank you. I think most of the responses covered a major chunk of why, at least I think that local systems and local manufacturing systems can thrive more, because I'm going to talk a little bit about the perspective of the artisan and the maker, the craftsman who's actually making the things that we wear and want to propagate. A lot of what they enjoy about and take pride in their craft is about how everything that they need to do with the material, with the fiber, the different processes are situated and are also sort of involves the whole family. That's not going to happen when you put sort of 100 weavers in one group and be like, okay, now you have to produce 10,000 meters of this fabric in this color. So that attachment and that association, that belonging that the maker and would have with the fiber and the sort of end product, I think thrives in the local system much more. And we talk about scaling up and sort of looking at how even the capacity can build from there. I think then looking at how such local models can exist in multiple, so that they can then cater to a larger unit. Yes, there are, if somebody is catering to a very large audience who wants standardized, has to the peculiarities and things that they're very particular about. But for me, as a designer and as an individual, I find the beauty of handmade in the fact that it's handmade and not made in factories, industrialized, absolutely similar pieces which are repeated multiple times. So yeah, definitely looking.
Thank you, all of you. I think it just shows what a vast array of different knowledge everyone has, which is fantastic. And I think that everyone's coming at it from a slightly different angle, which is wonderful for us, because we can actually join in that conversation and understand more of where it comes from, which is the next question was a bit like, it was really answered in the first one. So what I want to go on to ask about now is that environmental impact that everything has, and that interconnectedness that all our uses have. It's like we're talking about fibres. Fibres don't survive if we don't have water. So water is incredibly important. Food comes into that as well. Soils come into it. How do we look after our soils to produce these fibres, let alone the food? And also mental well-being, again, is a big part of it. And then the big one that everyone never really talks about is waste. Everything produces waste. And so all these systems are totally interconnected. And I would like your thoughts on that interconnectedness and what is important. What is the particular thing that you feel that stands out? And again, as Rachel said, it's that collaboration. And at the moment, we don't have enough of that collaboration. And it's that those large companies actually looking at the smaller businesses and finding ways of collaborating. So it's a huge question. It's a huge ask, but if you can sort of look at what is important to you in those various things. I know what mine is, soil.
Yeah, I think I echo that. Our interest in, or my personal interest in going into Pico and creating everyday basics was also my love of and wanting to understand more about farming, and us to have that connect between fashion and farming and how important it is. And I think it's a lot more tangible when you're thinking about food, but with fashion, it's harder to look at a piece of cloth and actually see all those processes and go right back to the soil. And then you're explaining to people about the difference between rain-fed cotton and conventional cotton, and actually all those different things. It's vast, but it's so important. And like the cotton that's grown, the Kava cotton that's grown near Khmer, that's a rain-fed cotton that's adapted over thousands of years, so that it is smaller. And again, it's all these things, it's compromises. You're not going to have the same amount, but you'll have cotton that is going to withstand more. It doesn't need as much water. It's purely rain-fed, and you don't have big irrigation systems, and you'll be doing multi-cropping, and farmers will be growing food alongside their cotton, and you can't do that on such scale. That's more, again, that's what the farmer needs, and giving them the respect they deserve, that they can understand what works well and what grows well next to their cotton, and what they need. Because if they just do a monocrop or something, it's going to be rubbish for the soil. It's going to be rubbish for them if they get a pest that comes and growing a crop that isn't actually that pest resistant, or they're putting pesticides on that is then becoming less and less pest resistant, because nature always wins in these things, and quite rightly. But I think it's a vast question about environment, but I think it's really key, and it's really key when we're at the very end of like the fashion side of things, to go right back to thinking about the soil and thinking about exactly where that fibre has come from, and the impact it's had on that soil, on the farmer, and on everyone else after. It's fascinating learning about it. I think when we even started Pico, we were thinking organic, and then you think that's the big thing, that's the eureka, it will be organic, and then you're like, oh, actually most of the organic cotton is an American variety that comes in and actually doesn't actually withstand that many pests, and it's grown on a monocrop, and it's not, and then you're like, oh, okay, right, so that's not perfect. So we then move on to something that's more natural and can have the seeds saved. Again, that gives the farmer, they don't have to buy seeds, which have become increasingly more expensive. And so all these things, it's like when you realize you're working more with nature, that nature is giving back to the people working with it as well. So I feel like I could go on for hours, but maybe I'll pass over to Jo.
And I'll go on for hours instead. No, it's a big one. I think for me, I started Where Does It Come From very much from the people point of view, actually, and the stories and the connection. And you realise that when you start looking at the farmers' lives and the people's lives, and people not having to move from cities into cities and that kind of thing, but everything is interconnected. So then you start learning about the soil and the farming and these types of seed and all the things that Phoebe's talked about. So it is one big thing, but for me it definitely started with the people and the trade justice and all of that. And on the other side of the supply chain, the customer, so what we want to call them consumer, citizen, and trying to make people understand a lot more about the processes of the people and the impacts that happen. And then this goes very much into what Rachel was talking about. So for me, changing the economic model and the way that customers see cloth and clothing and everything is a key one, a key thing that we need to focus on. So I was just thinking when Phoebe was talking, we're doing a project with a social enterprise up in Middlesbrough who wanted to make jeans, and we worked with our social enterprise providers in India to provide the cotton for them. But my customer rang me up in tears one day because she'd found Tesco selling organic cotton jeans for £15 a pair. And she's like, I can't do that. How do I compete with that? And then how do you communicate to a customer the difference between the fabrics and the making has been made by the covering addicts up in Middlesbrough? And how do you say to them, like, you can get them from Tesco's for 15 quid, or you can get them for whatever she decides to price them at? How do you communicate that value? How do you make people understand the impact all the way through the chain? So that's the kind of thing. And I did speak to someone from Tesco's unofficially, and basically I assumed it was a lost leader, but it's not. It's just the scale that they can buy in, that they can price things at that kind of price. So yeah, economic model change, and for me it's around the impacts and all the way through. So very big. I won't waffle anymore, and hand over to John.
I guess like on more of a basic level, when I started, I wanted to like champion natural fibres in general, and I think that's like, for someone, it's when we can kind of like talk about it amongst ourselves in terms of like the impact on the farmer and the soil and all that kind of thing, but for a lot of people, I think that's it's way too much to ingest, like from straight away when they're going to buy something new, or they're like thinking about how they want to change what they wear, how they want to like personally have less of an environmental impact. And so what I kind of tried to do was just kind of champion just the use of natural fibres just in general, and not really go into it more specific than that. And in the times when I have done that and explained, like for example, like the cotton from Cameo, and like gone into more detail, you can just see like immediately there's just like a disconnect, even from people who buy, like from the buyers that buy my clothes to sell in their stores. It's like it's almost too much for them initially to ingest that. I tried to make it kind of more basic initially, and then kind of build on that. But I just think that kind of, to get like the general public to that kind of just level of like not using man-made fibres like in anything is like the first step, and then the next step is then to go further into it from my perspective anyway. And that's already like such a huge task in and of itself. Yeah.
Okay. I'm kind of going to go big to start off with. We need to look at this as a whole system, I think. We're on a journey towards the regenerative, and that businesses will take this on their journey, okay? And you guys are all the pioneers of this. And yes, it's hard at first to do that, to be the pioneers. And I do go back to making this economic shift for this to be workable for any kind of consumer, which is exactly what Joe was talking about. Consumer, citizen, person, human. And I think that's where we kind of lose this disconnect, is like, we are all human and we all live together. And I'd like for there to be a world in my lifetime, at least in my children's lifetime, they're up there playing around, where we will see far more of a whole systems view, where it won't be weird to say, how is my neighbour? How is the water? How is the stream? And I think that's what we're missing, is in this disconnection with fashion itself. So I'll pass on.
Thank you. I think I have a number of different thoughts. Hello? Yeah, as everyone was speaking. Now, okay. Should I use? Hello? Yes? Okay? Okay, great. Okay.
Should I just like project? Is that better?
Or okay, great. Okay. So I think one of, especially as Joe and Phoebe were talking, one of the things that really came to my head is like in interconnectedness, you can't forget history as well. And when you were talking about American cotton took over India, why did American cotton take over India, right? Like, it wasn't just colonization, it was also the convenience that technology existed to only process longer staple cotton. Because like these technologies that were developed in the West, they didn't want to adapt them to Indian cotton, so they just shifted everyone to American cotton. That was like convenient. And so you realize that that it wasn't like some type of power choice. It was like a very in that mindset, very rational choice. Like, we already have this here, so why don't we just, and the whole system was lost, in that choice. But it just reminds me, like, there's all these reasons that we're here, and they include, there's many ways to regret the choices we've made. Especially I think as a young person, especially because I have the power of hindsight, I'm like, oh my God, like, how did we get here? Like, this seems so obvious now that these are the wrong choices to make. But I think that it's important to, I've been trying to like convince myself that it's important to like forgive in that cycle as well. Like, we are only, the interconnected is impossible to hold in one person's mind. It's such a complex being that even across us, like, it can't even be held in just this panel, right? There is such a little system. And I think what's important, I think that's where the collaboration comes in, where it's like, we need to remember that we cannot solve this individually. And I think that's what I always come back to, is like, when I talk to people, I feel hope. If I think about it alone, I feel like terrified. And I think as an engineer, especially with I think I also have a responsibility to bring that mindset to more engineers. I think there is a disconnect, like a huge disconnect, with like, there's an assumption, there's this very technocratic view that like, just make the technology work. But like, we know that the technology exists, biases us towards methods that aren't always good for people. I mean, just the switch to American cotton was one example of that. And I think, maybe this is like an education thing, I don't know the solutions, but I think that there is like definitely a focus on the designer and more artistic side in fashion to make that connection again, but it needs to be brought to the technology side. And I don't know if that actually exists right now, but something to also for me to think about. So yeah.
When I think of interconnectedness, like, the first thing which came to my mind was interconnectedness of social structure that in a lot of, at least Indian communities, is very strong. So something as simple as, say, when acrylic wood came into the market, because it was convenient, it was cheaper, easily, you can handle it much more, it's more convenient than hand-spun wool. I'm talking about this happening in Kutch. So the weavers started shifting the material slowly, and eventually there came a point where the herders, when they went out and sort of talked to them, they were like, there's nobody to buy our wool, we don't have means to earn, we're having to throw it away. So that, and another example you look at, India has had many indigenous strains of cotton which are local to the area. BT cotton came in, it's now grown most of the areas, and now the farmers are eventually like committing suicide because they're not earning anything out of it, it's not supporting them, it's not healthy for them in any way. So, I mean, it's just so intricately connected that, because I feel our disconnection to that interconnectedness is because of the sort of pace of life that has shifted. We want things quicker, we want things faster, and now it has to be a certain way, otherwise it's not acceptable. If you can't provide it, it's that attitude and that shift in living, I'd say, because even if you talk of local and centralized, if our pace of life had more patience, had more gratitude, had more love, I'd say, the value automatically comes in.
Thanks. I think we're all blown away by the hugeness of the question and how much it touches on, and where do we go from, where do we do and what do we go from here? So I'm going to throw in yet another one, which is another huge one, and it's what Soma has touched on, and it's the importance of technology. A lot of people in the artisan industry are really frightened of using technology because they think it's going to impact on their craft. But I think, especially as Saumya was saying, that it doesn't. It's the pace of life now is so fast that we can actually use technology in a way that might start to speed up things. It's like the solar chakras that we're looking at in India that can give women more of a living wage. It's like using UV light for processing wool. There's a whole gamut of things now that technology really helps, and I think it's time to get rid of the fear of using technology and to embrace it if it helps our practice. So I'd love to have everyone's thoughts on this tiny subject.
Yeah, I guess I personally have always been slightly, a big technophobe and pretty anti-technology, and now I'm going out with basically a computer engineer, which is very ironic, and he's always like, Phoebe, everything is technology, and that's the thing. And we were talking to Soma about reproducing medium scale processing units for flax in the UK, and similar to what Paula was touching on about solar panel spinning machines in India. It's like, where do we see technology starting? And for me, it comes back to when the people who are using that technology feel empowered, and it's not this monotonous task that is without love. Yes, that's then when I think technology can become if it becomes so fast and so far away from hand weaving and doing things with hand, which you can show impurities and individualities, which is beautiful. Then when something just becomes so uniform, that's when we get disconnected, and that's when I feel like we lose things through technology. But then at the same time, I think both working with fibres in India and working in fibres in the UK is so much of the time the thing that is missing is the medium scale production, and then we need technology. And we were talking yesterday about having tiered, Joe was talking about having tiered machines, so you have hand spinning, and then you might have something that is slightly more I was going to say technologized, and it has a slightly more a technological element to it, like having the solar panels, and then you might have a slightly bigger machine again. But I guess it's not having this fear, and actually seeing that we can all work together. And I think if the intentions are good, then there is a lot of space for it, like you were talking about with UV treatment. Maybe it's those things. It's we are in a different space now and time, and if things are in the right way, then I think they're we'll have to step back from being everything should be done by hand and having this really extreme ideology that only hand-woven things and hand-spun things are the best way. And I mean, we work with jersey because we have that limitation that we were well, people want really comfortable underwear, and this is what they're used to in the modern day. And so we started with that, which was kind of, I touched on yesterday when we went to Navdanya in the north of India, and we were learning about Gandhi and globalization and gross national happiness and doing everything with our hands. And we were talking to Vandana Shiva, and she was, kind of trying to persuade us to create Cardi bloomers again and all of this. But at the same time, she was like, I don't think it will happen. And I had a real existential crisis where I was like, we're about to be visiting a lot of small-scale factories as well as hand spinning units, and the dichotomy was always really throwing me. I was like, okay, these feel so far away from each other, but at the same time, there's benefits to both of them. Like I touched on earlier, like the dye waste unit, where the dye used for the organic dye that is used for our underwear is all recycled, and then any waste material is a building material. Now, technology did that, and and the pools of dye water are used as solar panels, which powers that whole process. And you're like, wow, that's really amazing. And everyone who worked there was so proud of showing us that system. And so then, I couldn't be like, no, this is awful, because I want the dye water to be processed in a way that gives back to nature and doesn't damage it. So I guess there is a stepping into this. We are in a new world, we're in a new time, and it's how we harness it. As long as it's being harnessed for good, I feel like.
Just give you the bad mics, naughty mic. Thank you. I think the thing to remember for me is that technology is a tool. So technology for technology's sake isn't what people are looking for, really. We want it to be something that helps us in our lives, helps people, not removes people from jobs. And I immediately think of things like in the supermarkets when they replace people on the checkouts and things like that. And my mum will go to those. But yes, I'm thinking about sort of negative versions of technology. Also in Africa, charities that I've spoken with, there's lots and lots of technologies scattered around places in Africa, probably other countries as well. They're being donated, but they were not appropriate. And the people there, it didn't work for them, so they just sit rusting in a field. And one particular example someone told me was about wells. So companies were donating their time and money to build wells for local people, but they were nomadic, so they just moved on, and then the well was left. You think that it wasn't appropriate. But anyway, I was thinking about the step ladder thing I was talking to you guys about yesterday. So when I was fortunate enough to be in Jaipur at a conference, speaking at a conference last year on Khadi in particular, and we were talking about the possibility of having a sort of step ladder model. So right at the top, you'd have the real luxury. Everything is handmade. Everything, the whole process is from cotton grown in the field or wool farmed in that area, and then that would be spun, woven by hand, all in the local area. And it's kind of, we could call it the Harris Tweed model, really. It's got its own special luxury branding, really, because it's so perfect, and the price goes along with that, and customers who buy that understand that. And then you maybe have a lower transparency, lower traceability, lower connected version of the same cloth effectively, but there's been some mechanization in there, so you haven't got that same individuality of cloth. And maybe you have the spinning being done with a machine that can spin 24 spindles at one time rather than one individual one. So you lose some of that uniformity, but then that gives you a model that you can work with to use technology to make prices lower, which, if you're trying to grow businesses, and that is required for big business, unfortunately. And then you've got the other one, the other steps in the ladder to go to as well. And the last point I was going to make was talking about technology as a tool. When I was over in India, one of my visits, looking around one of the cooperatives, the solar-powered charkers were used for the older women. They were the ones who were using them because it was seen as a reward. So they've committed their lives in the cooperative, they're part of that community, but then they worked with the solar charkers because they can actually produce more of the cloth and they would earn more money, but also it was almost a status symbol that they were using these machines. So I thought that was quite an interesting way of looking at it.
I guess in a lot of ways I'm like a massive technophobe and will not be kind of convinced otherwise. for lots of things. But I had a recent experience where last week I was in West Yorkshire visiting some archives of some very old, like worsted woolen mills. And I often like to go to see the archives because the fabrics in the archives are often way more interesting than what they're producing at the moment, and also often a lot more kind of like technical. And I'd always kind of wondered why they were more interesting and more intricate. Like, I don't know, my favorite kind of period of British wool is like kind of in the 1930s. So that's what I kind of go look for. And I'd never really asked this question to anyone who knew enough about it to give me like a good answer. But I was talking to the designer of this particular mill, and this particular mill was originally kind of way more technologically advanced than it is at its current day. So they had like everything on site. They had like small pattern looms. They had spinning on site, dyeing on site, and essentially that was the reason why they were able to make more intricate and interesting fabrics, was because they had like all of the technology there that enabled them to do so. But now to be able to do it, I think that they like own like the rights to the fabrics of maybe 4 previous mills which had closed down. And they were reselling one of the qualities that had been popular kind of forever. But the archive of that particular mill was held somewhere else, and they'd gone to visit it to see like what they had done with this particular quality in the past. And they were doing all these amazing things where they were using like yarns that had like 6 colours kind of twisted into it. And the only reason why they could have done that was just primarily because they had like the technology at that time, and now it's kind of regressed to the point where you could only make like these really basic fabrics. And I guess that was like, yeah, for me, where technology like would give me the thing that I wanted. And then similarly on the same trip, I'd gone to, there's like one fabric finisher, which is based in West Yorkshire. And I kind of went there kind of on a whim because I had some more time left before I had to get my train. And I arrived there, and it was this like gigantic kind of factory of like all sorts of things going on. I was thinking, maybe I actually don't really want to go in. But I did, and I met the person that who kind of runs it, and he kind of explained to me there was so many things where like they used like the steam from the finishing to kind of like power another process, and they were continually investing money into things like that that made them kind of more, I mean, in a way it's for them to kind of save money as well, but also it makes their kind of environmental impact much lower. So I guess, yeah, that was technology proving me wrong.
I guess it's whatever fits the purpose at the end of the day. And I think technology is just whatever intentions you put onto it. So we've been putting the intention of creating GDP growth for so long. So that's essentially what technology and industry has been going towards, right? So if we turn our technology towards nurturing regenerative systems, then of course that will be a great power tool for it, essentially. But ultimately, there's other systems that have been out there for years and years and years, for long before I was born, that are now coming into their own. There's a guy up in Sheffield who's been circularising knitwear and recycling wool for as long as I've been alive, since the 1970s. And now his way of working is becoming economically viable because everyone wants to do circularity. So I think that it's about intentions, and it's about, the right thing for purpose.
Thank you. I feel like for me, this question like goes back to interconnectedness, because I guess because handloom and Jutta, even not solar Jutta, they're technologies. At the baseline, everything you use to make a fabric is a technology. How much external energy you're using to drive it, that changes the scale and impact on all these things. But I think it's, especially as an engineer, I always enter technology as like my lens to like understand the world. Am I coming across? Okay, I don't know.
And so I think that it's very, for example,
the one of the first reasons I even was, awed by handling was witnessing, like just watching someone
like meditatively
use this machine with such expertise and
the type of complexity.
I think it may be closer to that. It's wired. Hello? Wait, it's wired. But I think like one of the first things that drew me in was witnessing, like watching someone weave on a hand loom, and the complexity in just a hand loom is insane. Like the type of detail and thought you have to put into any type of technology you develop. There is so much there's a lot of humanity within the design technology. I mean, I will say that some of it's stripped, especially when you start working like an engineering firm. You design like one small component that goes into a big machine, and then you become a cog in the machine, the same way that factory workers become. I mean, I've actually heard my own friends who work in these areas like, oh, I feel like a monkey. Like I have a strong engineering background, but I'm just doing the same task over and over. I think like the holistic design of technology used to be a very human thing. And there's that's like for me, it's like a drive. Like I want my dream is, my personal dream is to like make a jagged loom in my house and like make like weave, like that's like design it from scratch. Like that's like something that I think personally is very motivating. And I think from that lens, I have definitely seen how it can be dehumanizing as well. Even engineers dehumanized, right? And I think that again, what Phoebe was saying and Joe was saying, like it's a tool, and I think we need to be very careful about the balance and like how, like at what place does it turn skill to labor? They say that a lot, I think, when they talk about hand loom, like the fact that there's a type of control that you're able to have, and when does technology take that control from you and turn you into like just a user, and I think a lot more attention needs to be paid to that fine balance. And I guess just like a personal, like one of the reasons I was tuned into it is because the project I was working on in India was, it was a force-assisted loom, a drive-by wire loom, and the idea was, so there's hand loom, there's solar loom, there's power loom, but solar loom and power loom, they essentially do turn skill to labor. Like while solar loom at least is free of emissions, or relatively free of emissions, it still doesn't retain like the tension control, like the real artistry that's involved in hand loom is lost. Still, I mean, I think a lot of, or at least that's the consensus that I heard when I was there. And the project was an aim at essentially developing a system that was like power steering, but for hand loom. And like, it was something that requires a lot of precision. I learned as I was trying to work on it. But it's one of those things where that type of intervention can be used to retain that control, but also reduce, like, you can't deny the fact that like working hand loom 8 hours a day is very taxing. Like those are not realities. I think there are some people who like say like, oh, it's meditative, and like, yeah, it's meditative to a degree, and people will have different feelings about how meditative it really is. And often people tell me with meditative were people who are not actually weaving, and they were like, oh, I promise, like my whole set. And I was like, okay, but I'm not talking to the actual weavers, like it's okay. But I think that there are ways like that one being an example of ensuring the control is retained, but the effects that are frustrating can be like relieved, kind of. So that balance is something to, yeah. Let's switch.
That's what's
I don't have a lot to say, two main points. I think what technology can help us do is propagate natural fibers to an extent where everybody could be wearing it, and can also sort of help counter synthetic fibers because, yeah, I mean, the scale, the sort of numbers again come in, and we've reached a point where there are too many people on it, and they're going to keep growing. So obviously, like just handmade, handwoven is not going to and cannot cater to the masses. That was one, and the other is also, like in the past, like Soma mentioned, that if technology can be it has been created in the example of cotton to be able to only work with long staples. Then how do you then use technology to support indigenous varieties which are local? So that will automatically sort of at least help local varieties thrive and not just one standard material which has taken over and sort of eating the ecosystem and disturbing the microbiome to a certain extent. So I think that could be something where we could see major positive effects. Thank you.
Yes, really quick thing. Just really sorry to hold it. I was just thinking, just triggered by what you said. Actually, it's about one thing that technology has given us is mass production, which has fed overconsumption, and that's one of the dangers. It was never planned that way, of course. It was, but that's one of the dangers, and that's one thing that came out very strongly yesterday. Was I think Saumya Mini said there's enough clothes on the earth to clothe us all for 10 years now, so we don't need to be making all of these new clothes, you know. So one thing we need to look at is technology as a tool intent for where we're trying to get to, rather than continually producing cheaper and more efficiently and all that. So I think that's one thing to bear in mind.
I think everyone will agree that we've got a fabulous panel here, and they've all come up with some amazing thoughts for everyone to think about. And I was going to go on for another question, but I think that there's a lot there. And so if people would like to ask someone in the panel any questions, that would be fantastic. Any questions? I have thousands, but I'm not allowed to say. I have to shut up. Yes. Do you want the mic or are you just going to shout?
No, I'm just going to shout.
Good.
Okay. I guess it's quite interesting. I mean, the world of sustainable fashion seems to be, in some ways, kind of driven by consumers who are kind of interested in sustainability and interested in natural fibers. And then the mass market is kind of driven by this idea of like fast fashion. You know, as you mentioned before, textiles that are kind of produced quite cheaply and a mass scale. Are there any ways? It seems like the world of sustainable fashion relies on the consumers who are interested in sustainable fashion in the first place. But is there any way that we could use almost like the levers of mass fashion in a way to kind of almost like adapt it in some ways? So, Soma had mentioned, for example, how technology can be used to kind of increase the output and the efficiency, but also still retain the skill. Are there any other kind of ways that some of the values of mass fashion can kind of be also used, but with the lens of sustainability as well?
Yeah, but I'd say that it's not just down to the consumer to do it. I think that it's the designer is the person that has the power in that situation. So whether they choose, they have the choice of using a sustainable material or not a sustainable material. And kind of the way that I approach it is that I don't really think about the consumer at all. I just make what I am interested in making, and I just use all I use all sustainable and natural fibers, and then hopefully through, I don't know, learning about my company and what they're buying, maybe through the store or whatever, then they will kind of be able to educate themselves about what they're purchasing. But I think for me, it's not like it's more important initially to create a product which is like interesting that someone wants to buy, and then the fact that it's completely sustainable is like the added bonus on top of that. But I think that for me, that's that way to approach it is the most important part of what I do in a way. And I feel like, yeah, because if you're approaching it thinking like, oh, there's a lot of people that want to buy sustainable clothing, and you're just then trying to cater to a market, I think it's the wrong way to approach it, because it's not your decision inherently. You're not the one that's like, you're potentially not the one that's motivated to use sustainable methods or sustainable fabrics. You're being influenced by a market, and I think that it should be the designers that are influencing the market rather than the other way around, because they have the power to change everything. So I think that's where it needs to come from. All the people that are above the designers for really huge companies that control the budgets, and they would say that maybe, I don't know, there's an option between a sustainable cotton and then a non-sustainable cotton. A non-sterile cotton is like, I don't know, £2 cheaper a metre, and they're forced to make the decision using the non-sustainable one because that's, I don't know, the numbers are better for that. So yeah, it's the changes within a very small amount of people to be able to influence the mass market. So, yeah.
I was going to speak to the mass market because you were talking about the designer having kind of the influence. I was a designer for 23 years in the mass market, and the designer didn't have any influence on what was going on in terms of, we were looking at price massively. We were constricted by that price, that kind of getting it to market on time, moving it from China or wherever. So there was a huge, in the mass market, they're almost like dinosaurs trying to move into this sort of space. So I think that what we're doing here in the smaller industry can be created, but in more small production hives, that then can be then access these other bigger companies. But I think what you were asking was also how can we use that kind of information, or the kind of old systems that they had. And I think in some respects they can, in terms of the marketing and the marketing that we could do as small businesses that come together collaboratively. So imagine all of those small businesses coming together collaboratively and co-marketing what we're creating, as if we were a big boohoo company, right? But we're not going to be boohoo, obviously. We're going to be like proper sustainable boohoo. But I think it's making that easy as well. What happened going into the fast fashion era was that it was easy for everyone to get involved with it, and I think that that's the shift that we need to make it easy for everyone to get interested in it.
Yeah, I think we touched on it yesterday as well. Saumya was talking about like legislation within some of the big industries to actually hold them accountable to their decisions about their sustainability decisions. And I think a big thing for me, again, that was really highlighted yesterday was about value. Like we visited organic farmers cooperatives in India where H&M is asked to buy all their organic cotton for the next 5 years, but at a lower price than what the market was, but they were guaranteeing them 5 years. 5 years of safety net, but it's that thing again. It's like we can't just make it cheaper. We can't fit that model into a fast fashion model. Like it doesn't work. And I think we've seen this year as well. It's like when we've been buying organic cotton in India, that because there was a massive shift of big brands coming out of China and going and buying organic cotton from India, there was a massive shortage of organic cotton, and we're going to see that in impacts over the next couple of years in the industry, where they're actually, this is more like for jerseys and things like that, but that's because there is a big interest from the mass market, but they want it cheap still, and they're buying in bulk, and there basically was nothing on the market left, which was huge. We were like, right, okay, we just can't get it, and the price went up by 40%, which is good, but I doubt that that was going back to the farmers and the producers, but that was just because the market was talking. So I don't know, I feel like there has to be a big shift, and we talked about yesterday that whether it is possible for these big brands in the mass market to be purely sustainable when they're working on that scale, and have that, is that connectivity possible? I don't know. Like, for example, we had someone from COS who saw what we'd been doing and said, oh great, that looks really good, like tracing all our supply chain. And they said, oh, we should copy that. And they were, and I was like, yeah, what? No, like don't, you can't just copy it. It requires like a lot of time and energy and understanding and going and learning about these different processes. But it was like, they were like, oh, like that sounds great. We should do that, because they know that the market is shifting and people are more interested in sustainability. But again, I think we've often talked about this balance. It's like we don't want it to be an ostracized thing where it's only a luxury product, and sustainability has to be something that we can all access, but it's at the same time, we can't lose the value of what it is to be sustainable. And a £15 organic cotton jeans is because it's on mass scale, and the farmers might not be getting very much money for that organic cotton, and it probably, I imagine from our experience, it could even be the same price as standard cotton. They're just producing less. So, you know, it's like, again, it's needing that story and needing that transparency. Otherwise, it's just greenwashing, I think, a lot of the time. And I think we have to be really careful of that in the mass market. And where I end up going is that, again, kind of what you were talking on, Rachel, of like having lots of small companies coming together and being like, this is our shared ethos, whether that's under the umbrella of fair trade or Safi and Minnie was talking about yesterday, then we have like a slight assurance of this is what we're working on. But even then, I think there needs to be deeper transparency. So I'll stop.
Probably just adding to that as well. I mean, you've got the main issue, we've said it already, is to do with price and cost and what customers will spend and the whole economic model and, you know, all of that. I think until that's fixed, until customers don't get the opportunity to go into a shop and buy something for £5 or £10 and have no connection to how that is made, then that's one thing that we need to fix somehow, and that's difficult. I mean, John was talking about the level that you can communicate, because it's about taking the customer on a journey, isn't it, from their not knowing anything to knowing all about cotton seeds and farming techniques and solar charcoal and all of that. So there's no point in going, hey, let me tell you absolutely everything about this garment. It has to be something that connects with them. And we try to do it by story, but it's a difficult one to do that. And then sometimes people will understand that they need to spend more, but at the same time, you know, most people don't have that money and they don't want to spend more. So there's a level thing there. The one thing that I think we can do, which I think will solve an awful lot of problems, is really pressure the big brands into not using plastic. And I think the recent RSA report, which was saying that I think it was the majority of fast fashion brands use some kind of virgin plastic in all their garments, and I think it was around 50% of fast fashion brands, and it was Boohoo, ASOS, Pretty Little Thing, and Misguided, I think it was, and they basically have around 50% of their garments are 100% virgin plastic. So I think if we can get the message across to those brands that isn't acceptable, and we can get customers to go in at the other end and say, we don't want anything with plastic in, then I think that's a good first step that we can make.
I feel like I definitely, I think on the end of how to do it kind of in a small scale is very, or like how to shift it if you're just thinking about customers and the businesses that make the clothing. I think it's a very complex relationship, right? Because what shapes customer aspirations is very complex. I feel like and this is just broadly, I feel like there is a role that the place we're at and the place where we need to be, there is such a vast gap that in some senses, like, it's impossible. I feel like it's impossible to talk about governments and the types of the role they need to play in enforcing labor laws and actually bringing in environmental impact laws and taxations, because that does not exist at all at any scale. And I think because, like, as you were saying, like, price is such a huge driver, and the only way to, like, I think, or like not the only way, like one of the biggest levers in big companies is, like, you have to buy it at a higher rate because you're doing all these other things, and that's the only way that, like, broadly other smaller places who are having such a hard time competing, the playing field is leveled. There's a lot of how do you shape customer aspirations, but customers also, like, there's such a, it's a very complex playing field, and having to constantly think about every choice you make and whether it's sustainable or not, it's exhausting. It's exhausting living a sustainable life. Like, I'm exhausted. I try a lot and I'm exhausted. And people who, like, barely have any interaction with that space, like, the government is supposed to play a role of taking some of that, yes, exactly. Like, they're supposed to employ the experts who tell you, is this good or bad? Is this, like, a company employing practices that are actually beneficial or not? And there's a huge lag, a gigantic lag, especially environmentally. And I don't necessarily have the answers to how to help those space without including that stakeholder.
Yes. Do you want the mic? No. So just going back on your questions about technology, I'm always have a thing about recycled fabric, because obviously we do have so many clothes in the world already. So I suppose, like, because we're talking about natural fibres, where do you see the role of kind of recycling what we already have, or recycling those natural fibres back into something else?
I think it's interesting you asked that, because in the project that I'm thinking of, I'm looking at how when we create waste, we deem it wasteful. You're essentially taking away value from it and saying that it is useful for nothing. So obviously, like, I personally feel there is a lot more scope in, as designers or as critical thinkers, how do we then change the perception of waste, and how do we add value to that waste? Because in biodesign, like, one of the things that I was interested in was looking at the waste wool which is produced within the UK, and how do you then transform it using enzymes produced by bacteria into a completely new material. So the wool is not wasted, you get another material, it's low carbon footprint, very less amount of heat emissions because they're enzymes. So I think there's a huge scope in repurposing the materials which already exist as weight on this planet and even around us.
I think I have not heard about this biological enzyme used to recycle fibers, and I think that's actually quite an interesting way, possibly a much better way. But one thing, I'm a little bit suspect sometimes of, like, recycling fabric and even circular economy concepts, because they don't, a lot of times when people talk about circularity, they still assume growth. And you're like, oh, as long as I recycle all the waste, like, it's fine. No, there's carbon emissions that come from recycling also. And that type of biological way, I mean, very cool, but definitely not something like when I see recycling fiber facilities, they're hugely carbon intensive, and they're in fact like producing a lot more, as opposed to like if that thing was made naturally and was allowed to like biodegrade, it would likely have less impact than recycling it using these shredding technologies. And I mean, and so you'd say that like it's like biodegrading is not like circular in the technological sense, but it's circular in like the biological sense. And I think it's really important to think about, like, if you're talking about a fabric that has a bunch of plastic content that you think about recycling, you need to think about like, is it really worthwhile to keep this like type of fabric within the system? And I think I don't know, I haven't done on any of the calculations about the real impacts versus like if you recycle something that's already natural and all these things. And I think that there needs to be a lot more. You can't just throw the word circular around and assume that means good. I think a lot of people do, and I think soil to soil is a better. I think soil to soil has better foundational principles than circular sometimes. Circular is becoming too much of a buzzword for me, where I'm like, there's so many intricacies to like what that really means. And in fact, if you just make certain fabric productions a lot more efficient in how they cut the material, or how they, like, there's so many efficiency protocols that are not followed in factory models because of price, essentially. But those could actually reduce emissions a lot more than if you turn the whole system circular. And you have to still, if the whole system becomes circular, you're still producing the same amount of waste, and you're adding a process to like turn it back. But if you also just use less material from the get-go, it might be good to have like a recycling facility that uses that less amount. But the real impact is like in reducing. They say like it's like thin versus thick circularity. Like you want it to be a really thin. Like you want to reduce the materials, and whatever you are making, yes, make it circular. But a focus should be on thinness, not like thickness. Like there needs to be both of those elements to that discussion.
For me, yes, we can't have fast circularity. We can't just move from a notion of let's do fast fashion and just move to fast circularity. That's not going to work. But what you're addressing is the stuff that's in existence at the moment. What would be the best thing to do that? And again, that's per item, per thing. What is the best in situ thing to do with that? And there's loads of excellent projects that are out there in circularity, and we're also using like things from other industries that are going to waste, like seatbelts that we love and know are good friend doing that. So yeah, I think the main thing we need to do is look at how long that's going to be in the system, and longevity is really important, even looking at the waste that we have already. And I think we still have to address it. We can't just burn it all and start again. So yeah.
I think it depends on what components you're looking at as well, because there's some lovely exhibitions in here of different bits of fabrics being put together in different ways to make new garments. There's lots of different ways of recycling things without having to process them, just using cutting up one thing and making something else with it. I'm going to bang on about plastics again, sorry. I've got a thing about plastic. But we're seeing a lot of main brands at the moment saying, yeah, we want to put elastane in things, or we're going to make this out of recycled plastic. So that's okay, everybody, because it's recycled plastic. But and yes, we do have loads and loads of plastic in the world that needs to be used. My personal view is that clothing is not the answer for that, because as soon as you wash clothing with plastic in, you get microplastics, blah, blah, blah. So maybe using it for something different is a better idea. But again, watch out for the greenwashing when it comes to recycling.
Yeah, I think just adding on that, it's understanding more in depth about the processing it takes to do that recycling. And like Soma was saying, even we're producing swing tags for our garments made out of the like waste bits of fabric from our patterns for the underwear. But it's like then stepping into that thing of like, what is that process? Like this is being done by hand, sure. So then it's like, it's not intensive, but then actually when you look at a lot of the recycling processes, they are really intensive. And it's like, I guess we were talking about bamboo earlier. You're like, oh, great, natural fiber, but the process is it's a highly chemical process. So therefore, again, it's like with recycling, it's like those words, it's like they can be very different, and it's not actually, I don't know, I think a lot more research needs to be done, and like, yeah, we've got all this fabric and we've got all these clothes now, like what is the best thing to do with them? Like if we're stripping them apart and recycling every thread, like elastin in them, like is that better than finding another option for it? What even is that comparison for it to going in landfill? Like I'm definitely not for landfill at all, but we just don't know. Like, and I think we can very quickly be like, okay, yeah, let's recycle it because it feels better if we're stripping it down in a highly industrialized process that's giving off loads of carbon and chemicals and all these things, and that's not great either. So I think it's a really difficult one.
I think we're hugely running over time, which is good because there's lots and lots of things that people still want to say. And I know that every time someone comes back with something, I have another question that pops up in my mind. So I'm sure that all of you must too. But I think unless there's any pressing questions, we better you've got a pressing question.
I think I don't know, it might be a useless one. So you guys can like brush over quickly.
Yeah, please.
No, I'm good. It's more to do with like collaborations as a tool. John said about how designers and even brands are the ones that should dictate what's cool or what's influencing what we buy or purchase. And I agree with that. Whether it works or it doesn't, that's another question. But how are collaborations fitting into this? Because you just mentioned about COS and COS looking at what you're doing, and maybe you said copy it, but I would call it ripping it off. But why couldn't they just do collaboration? I don't believe in mass marketing, or I don't believe in mass production because it doesn't really make sense. Although it sounds like a good idea, you want to help everyone, you make things cheaper. You just said that all the clothes, there's enough clothes to like keep us not working for 10 minutes. But why can't we do like a collaboration or something like that? I saw, the dyeing company Boesu, they worked with Nike. Nike are a massive company. They're not making a million trainers, but they might make a few trainers with that, or just maybe even one, just to like show people that the dyeing company. So like I don't have any experience with like some experience with collaboration, but like a small designers or independent designers or brands. Has that ever been a conversation, or is that like a dead end as well?
You're right. I think collaboration is got to be the way going forward. It's what Rachel's going to talk about in about 2 seconds. I can imagine if I give her a mic. Yeah, but I think collaboration is a really key thing, and trying to, before I hand over to Rachel, a message of hope really, because I think that is the message of hope, that we're here talking about it, and we've got future designers over here who are going to be out there talking about it. And what we want to do is, even if our own businesses don't become massive businesses or even survive the next 10 years or anything like that, the fact that we're talking about it, we are influencing customers, we're influencing big brands, and hopefully the collaborations will happen between the people with the ideas and the big brands who want to take those ideas or use those ideas. Anyway, beware, there's going to be a collaboration chat coming up now.
All about collaboration. So that's exactly what I started the ecosystem incubator for, to have people start to come together. Within my sort of life as a fashion designer, everyone was very separate, and even when I went into sustainability, I still felt that everything was very separate. So I wanted to create a space where all of the brands brands, artisans, PhD students, it doesn't matter, intergenerational respect is one of the massive keystones of what we're doing. So it's to have people come together on this platform and start to create collaborations. And that's not collaborations like that don't create win-wins. This is actual business. Let's create win-wins together and work together for minimum order quantities, for co-marketing, for building up strategies that haven't even been created yet. And for me, that is the most innovative space to be in, where you start to bring all of these minds together. Your mind, my mind, Kishal's mind, Paula's mind, there's people joining the platform who've been in circularity for years and years, and have been coining this phrase for all these years. It's never happened 100%, has it yet? But it could do in collaboration, I think. So look at theecosystemincubator.com and join us.
Just can I add something? We're here together because of a collaboration.
Yeah. I guess just one thing I'd add is collaboration is great, but it has to be done for the right purposes. So the thing with Nike is that just for them to greenwash themselves to
somebody in Nike's been working with them as well. They
Okay.
you an ambush.
Mhm.
So she started it first. She was
Yeah.
working with them, and then the main company did something with them as well. The
Mhm.
sneaker.
Yeah,
So I think it's an ongoing.
yeah.
Whether it's
I guess I just worry that whether those things are used as just like purely marketing tools or they're done with a genuine need to make things more sustainable. And then I guess, but then and then on the other side of the spectrum, I guess collaborations that I do with smaller artisans also, I don't have the biggest company in the world, but then there's other smaller, really minor artisans that I work with, and then I kind of bring their work to a different to an audience. So I think you can do you can also do it on a really micro scale, which could also potentially have more influence over the market than a huge collaboration where people just take it as they don't even really, maybe they don't even read the sign that's next to this thing about, I don't know, a course collaboration with Under everything. They just see it and just buy it because they like it. I think that it's, I don't know, there's a question of how, I don't know, it's all about having influence over the consumer and what's the best thing to do that.
I think, just echoing that, I think it's about intention and also I guess what I was touching on earlier about some of the bigger brands just expecting organic cotton to be at really the same price and those kind of things. It's if the intention isn't there or the understanding that this is so much, the value and that actually when things are smaller scale, they do cost more because you're not doing mass production and things. So it's I think intention and value has to be really key, and it has to not be just about sustainability is more of a thing now on trend, and so let's buy into that. And I think that's where can be a bit complicated with big brands, but then there are people in those bigger brands that do have more of a passion to wanting to change from the inside, and we've got to hope that they either do that or they scale down, or I don't know, there's multiple ways. But I think collaboration as a whole, definitely following on from what John said, that's massive for us as a small brand. We've collaborated, whether it's with cooperatives and communities, and now we're collaborating on a project in the UK with various artisans in the UK and with shoemakers, and it's that sharing of skills, and Kishore touched on, that's what this whole event is about, and what it has been about for the last years is sharing on skills and knowledge. And I think Saumya said yesterday, and it's been touched on again today, it's we can't make change as one person, and we all have to come together, and then it's domino effects, and it's talking to loads of different people about what we know and share with each other. So
brilliant, everyone. Thank you. We're now terribly over time. You're wanting cups of teas and coffees, and which there is over there. But I would really like to thank our fabulous panelists for being so, I don't even know, so wonderful. So they can be fabulous and wonderful, and talking about everything. And I'm sure that you can find them if you want to continue any conversations. You can find them having tea and coffee. But we've also got another session here, which is on British fibres, and we've got some more fabulous panelists. But first of all, thank you all.
There's lunch that people can come to.
Okay, yes, and there's also there's some delicious lunch that people